How are you, folks? Dave Brown here with the New Populist. Thank you again for joining me. Every day we see these articles coming out from the mainstream media that are so ridiculous. You just wonder why they keep on, pumping this stuff out there. And the unfortunate truth is that there is a pretty large segment of our population that is ignorant and can be persuaded by propaganda. And that is why the government does it. Now, why does the government want to have more controls on information? Well, 50% of the population are gullible, but there's the other 50% that they worry about fighting back against them. And that's why we see, different tech platforms trying to limit free speech. But that being said, uh, again, a good portion of the population does fall for these propaganda pieces. And I saw one recently from a few days ago in the Telegraph, an article written by a former British military officer, where he's having this wet dream about Russia having another revolution like 1917 and the country, splitting apart and Putin being dragged away somewhere. And this is a really popular dream among the neocons in the West and in the UK and the United States. If there was one thing that they could have more than anything else, one wish, it would be for Russia to collapse. That's their dream. Now, of course, it's not going to happen. A lot of their reasonings for why it might happen are ridiculous, which is why I'll go through this article and sort of talk about these things. But another thing I want to point out too is that the way we look at Russia, we think of Russia as being these different groups who are sort of being forced together under the Russian Federation, kind of like with the Soviet Union. But there's actually a little more diversity than one might realize, especially in the military. For example, the head of the Russian defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, his father is of Tuvan descent, and that is a group that is indigenous to Siberia. And there's also a general. He is the, I think, deputy commander of the Russian armed forces. His name's Alexei Kim. And Alexei Kim is actually ethnically Korean. His parents came over here back obviously in the Soviet Union times, and back in 1950s, and he was born in the Soviet Union, and he's a very high-ranking Russian general of Korean descent. So it's not like there's this Slavic ruling class and there's no other people. Other people within Russia of different ethnicities are part of the military and government. And and that, again, that's part of the thinking we have here in the West, is that all these ethnic minorities are just, clamoring to get away from Russia because they're being abused, when in reality, many of them have significant roles within the government. So it's Russia's not quite as separate as we think it to be. But I want to go through this article and just point some things out, because the comparisons to 1917 are just preposterous. And when I read it, I'll stop and point out exactly why. And this article is titled "The Horrifying Russian Revolution Will Unleash Horrifying New Demons," written by Richard Kemp. And again, Richard Kemp is a former British military officer. And the article begins, if Yevgeny Prigozhin's latest bombast against the Russian MOD, and by inference the Kremlin itself, should not be seen as just another rant from a blowhard with a track record, his extraordinary threats of internal violence, mobs with pitchforks, and even revolution are a stark indicator of just how serious things are getting behind the scene for Putin's regime. Now, Prigozhin, guy is 80% troll. He says things that are true, but he is a propaganda agent for Russia. He would not be allowed to do what he's doing if you were undermining the Russian government during a time of war. So why these people buy into this idea that Prigozhin is somehow giving you an insight into what's going on internally in Russia? I can't understand it. I mean, clearly the guy would be dead right now if he were actually threatening Putin, threatening Shoigu, threatening the high command in Russia. And I remember earlier in the month he was talking about how Wagner didn't have enough weapons and ammunitions, and this was a huge problem. And then 3 days later they take Bakhmut. So it's like, wait a second, you were out there making all this noise about not having enough munitions, and then you took the city. So what you're saying and what's happening isn't quite lining up. This might shock people out there, and pay very close attention here. Russians also use propaganda. Isn't that what we said for the last 88 years in the United States? Russian propaganda. So when Prigozhin does it, and it's not propaganda, it's insight into the issues inside the Kremlin. It's, again, nonsensical. Prigozhin was predictably swift to claim credit for his Wagner forces in the capture of Bakhmut, but seemed to place greater emphasis on the cost. He claimed 20,000 of his own men had been killed, which is almost certainly a gross underestimate. And to that, we must add a very large number of Russian army troops. Given that possession of Bakhmut brings Russia no obvious strategic or even tactical gain, Prigozhin's apocalyptic talk almost echoes the sentiments of King Pyrrhus of Epirus after he defeated the Romans at the Battle of Asculum. I'm probably not pronounced that right. That one other such victory would utterly undo him. Now, 20,000 dead, right? Wagner. And this guy's saying, and a bunch of other Russian troops. Well, Wagner was the frontline assault troops. The Russian troops in the back, they were providing artillery after Russia or after Wagner would expose certain positions. So I don't think there's much credibility to the idea that regular army troops are being killed in Bakhmut in addition to the Wagners. It was primarily Wagner. Again, the Russian army sitting back with the artillery, lobbing in shells. That was their job. And this other point that Bakhmut had no strategic value, we had Zelensky say back in March that if Russia took Bakhmut, it would allow them an opportunity to go to other cities, and that's why Bakhmut was so important. So we see this thing that the media does. They rewrite the history in real time. So whatever happens, they just pretend that what they said 2 or 3 months ago never happened. And it's funny because we have the internet. We can just Google it. Oh wait, this city was important 3 months ago when you guys thought you were winning and holding the city, and now that you lost it, oh, it was never important. My God, we have Google. We can look it up. Well, the one of us who care to pay attention, we look it up and go, wait, this is nonsense. But again, 50% of our country, they're not paying attention, so they fall for propaganda. But let's continue. Bakhmut stands as an allegory of the entire Russian war so far, inflicting huge damage at great cost and to no advantage. If it continues in this vein, Prigozhin's vision of revolution is not impossible. He spoke of 1917 when soldiers and their families stood up against the Russian government. But you don't need to go that far back to draw even closer parallels to what is happening today. The war in Afghanistan played a major role in the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991. Now, the Russian Revolution, 1917. What caused it? Well, we can talk for hours about that. But a few facts here. Russia was at war. They had lost 2 million troops in World War I, including 1.5 million civilians. This was when the Bolsheviks, the Marxist movement, was at its peak. Obviously, the Bolsheviks overthrew the government in October 1917. And this was at the end of the Second Industrial Revolution, where the average conditions for workers working in factories in Russia, in Germany, and England were horrific. So this is early, early 20th century, before we had that leap into during the 1950s, where things as far as the conditions and the availability of resources for your average person, rapidly improved. So 1917, the war, the massive death, the Marxist, the conditions as far as the workers, and the fact that we were having this czarist system that that obviously they wanted to bring to an end across Europe. We have different countries have the revolutions to get rid of the monarchy. So all those conditions together, led to the October Revolution. But if you listen to Lenin and Trotsky themselves, they said they won by a hair. If a few small things went against them, it would have failed. So it took a lot, a lot of things to come together in order for the revolution to be successful. Unlike the German Revolution in 1918, which was unsuccessful, and several people got executed for trying to execute that revolution. Rosa Luxemburg, for example, one of the people executed for the attempted overthrow of the government in 1918. So 1917 was a special set of conditions that bear no comparison to what's happening today. Right now in Russia, we have how many casualties? This is debatable because the Western sources say, the Russians, they have all 200,000 dead. I think the Ukrainians claim like 250, and just this ridiculous numbers. More realistically, it's probably around 40, 50,000 maybe. This is a year and a half into this conflict, and many of these casualties are DPR, LPR militia forces, not regular Russian military. And then the Wagners, of course, the Wagners are there, a lot of prisoners are in Wagner. So these aren't your average person being pulled off the street in Moscow, being sent to the front. These are your convicts, your prisoners, which is really actually quite a smart way to execute a war. Take a force, that's your assault troops who's doing all the dying, and pick them out of the prison system. Pretty smart. So maybe 40, 50,000 dead, far cry from 2 million in World War I. So again, the comparison between now and World War I and 1917 is just not even the same thing. And depending on your beliefs, there's more justification for this, what's happening here. Obviously, the neocons and Ukraine, the overthrow of the government, shelling the Donbass. It's, very complicated and very touchy for people because any suggestion that Russia may have had a reason to invade Ukraine is going to just, you get attacked for saying that, and you're not supposed to say that. So again, the comparison 1917, 2023 doesn't really work out. He goes on to say in the article, originally conceived as a short-term intervention like Ukraine, the campaign, in fact, went on for 10 years and cost more than 15,000 Soviet lives. Defeat at the hands of U.S. armed Mujahideen fighters humiliated and discredited the Soviet army, vitiating the glue that was so essential in holding the country together. Loss of perception of military invincibility emboldened dissidents, including disaffected war veterans and their families, especially in the non-Russian republics, which provided a disproportionate quantity of the fighting troops and the casualties. Afghanistan also undermined the confidence of Soviet leaders to rely on the army to quell rebellion. Anti-war feeling grew among the population as the conflict round on and casualties built up, causing a fundamental shift in the hitherto compliant media, which began to publish non-approved news stories about what was going on in the war and at home. Now, it's kind of funny talking about how Afghanistan was a problem for the Soviet Union. Of course, it was. And then the United States went to Afghanistan for 20 years, didn't win, left in the middle of the night, and the Taliban took half our equipment and started. Now there's that. So we both screwed up in Afghanistan. Did this did this end the Soviet Union? No, the Soviet Union was on that trajectory. I don't look at the collapse of the Soviet Union as being some sort of secondary event after 1917. It's all part of the same thing. The Soviet Union was doomed for failure, and the collapse of '91 is just finishing, what happened in 1917. So finally, we got the collapse. The Bolshevik, legacy can go away now, although obviously Lenin is still, very much loved in the Soviet Union or in Russia. But we finally have no czar. We have no Soviet Union, no communist government. And so modern day Russia is what should have happened back in 1917 if the interim government under Alexander Kerensky had been more competent and were able to hold off the Bolsheviks who came in October 1917 for the second revolution in 1917, getting rid of the interim government. So the collapse of the Soviet Union really, again, is just a continuation of the 1917 revolution and the Bolsheviks and the communism. So I don't think occupying Afghanistan was that significant as far as the real underlying cause for why the Soviet Union finally collapsed. Article continues. All these effects are more acute today, with vastly greater casualties in a much shorter time, inflicted on a significantly smaller population, and in an era where the internet and social media throws military ineptitude under much more intense spotlight than was ever imaginable back in the days of Afghanistan. The impact of a catastrophically failing war could perhaps be weathered better in a country with greater structural resilience. But the Russian Federation is hyper-fragile with its energy-dependent economies, ruptured by sanctions, rampant corruption, increasingly resented by population with limited prospects of prosperity, further diminished by war, growing ethnic resentments among non-Russian populations who have paid the highest price in the fighting, and a political system totally dependent on Putin's cult of personality that has now been harshly exposed as damaged goods. If this war does lead to fundamental change in the Russian Federation, it is likely to follow a much rockier road than the breakup of the Soviet Union. One thing we should not expect to see is an emergent regime that wants to end the war, usher in a new democracy, and establish cordial relations with the West. Now, he talks about the Federation being hyper-fragile. What were the predictions for the Russian economy after all these sanctions were put in place? It was supposed to cause a complete collapse, 15% retraction in GDP. Never happened. So I'm not sure how we're saying it's hyper-fragile when we have this repudiation of all the, all the predictions just not turning out from a year ago. So I don't get that one. As far as an energy-dependent economy, well, guess what? If there's one thing that you can really useful to have in your economy is energy. All of these economies like China, who are growing, India, they need the energy to fuel their economic growth. If you got natural gas, oil, minerals, all that, you have customers. And then clearly, as we've seen, China is working with Russia. And India is saying, we're not taking sides here. Let's keep on sending some of those natural resources over here. We're not going to go along with the United States with all these sanctions. So the two largest countries in the world by population aren't playing the game, and they're obviously buying Russian goods, Russian natural resources. And finally, don't expect another Mikhail Gorbachev. Instead, we could well be looking at a protracted scenario of chaos, violence, rebellion, and repression, With fighting between the Russian army, National Guard, security services, the plethora of private armies, and perhaps Prigozhin's visions of mobs on the streets with pitchforks. Wow, this guy really paints a picture of complete chaos in Russia. I mean, come on, man. Even if it does not collapse into ethnic fiefdoms, it will be fought over by competing hardliners, incensed by the betrayal of their forces by a corrupt elite. None of this might happen, of course. It won't. But we should remember that the disintegration of the Soviet Union was unexpected both in scale and speed, and it was too big to fail. If, however, something like this does come to pass, the fall of the Russian Federation might diminish the present threats it presents to European and global security. But this time, let's not hear any talk of peace dividends, because we can be certain of one thing: Russia will rebuild itself and once again come out fighting. Well, Christ. So he gets this collapse, but then he says, well, that won't stop anything. They'll regather and they'll come fighting again. So what do you want Russia to do then? No matter what they do, they're the enemy and they're evil and they're going to come fight everybody. I don't know what their solution, what they think is going to end the violence and bring peace. I have an idea. I guess they want this collapse of the Russian government, and they want Western interests to go in there and start doing their work like they did their work in Ukraine and Georgia, other places, really turning Russia into a vassal state of the West. That is when Russia becomes good. When Russia is integrated into the Western system, we have access to their resources, and they are completely pacified. Kind of like Germany today. They have a nice economy. They're a powerful country as far as their economic, potential and size, but they have zero balls. They do what they're told. We cuck them all the time, like when Biden said that we're going to blow up Nord Stream, and the Germans were standing right there, and Biden didn't care. Well, what are they going to do? Say no to the United States? Push back? Hell no. They do what we say. And so we blew it up, and the Germans kept their mouth shut and started, maybe the Ukrainians did it. Maybe there was some guy on a boat with some dynamite and some flippers. Like, no, of course we did it. But they won't say anything. And again, they've been, since World War II, neutered. They're part of the Western system. They're part of NATO. And they are essentially, in some ways, a U.S. puppet, as is much of Western Europe, unfortunately. Obviously after World War II, we needed change, but we just moved from having, the British Empire fell apart as far as their power and influence, and then the U.S. Empire started. Same old thing happening. Another empire steps in, starts controlling everything, starts dictating terms to everybody. Has their hand up everybody's backside, controlling things. And being a student of history, eventually every empire collapses, every empire fails. And instead of, fighting it out, duking it out, trying to use the military and proxy wars to maintain power, I say, let's not do that. How about we just have mutual cooperation among powerful countries across the world, whoever they might be, whether it's China, India, Russia, Germany, Japan, whoever it is, mutual cooperation. But again, like I say in my past videos, the American ruling class, the elites, the transatlanticists, they are playing a zero-sum game. Any other country, their economic development, their increasing military power, if it's happening outside of the sphere of the United States and the West, that is a threat. And that cannot be allowed, and they have to contain that threat and be proactive in trying to prevent it. And right now, it's Russia, but in the future, it'll be China. And who knows, maybe one day or 50 years from now, it'll be India. Who knows? But there's always a threat coming. Always. We spent 20 years in the Middle East. It's the threat of Islamic terrorism. Actually, let's go back further. It was the Soviet Union for decades. The Soviet Union collapses. And almost like magic, we had the terrorism, Islamic terrorism, and that goes on for 30 years, from the mid 90s till now. About 20 years actually. Let's back it up. So finally, that kind of quiets down, and Afghanistan's over. We get out of there, and right when you think maybe now we can sort of stop the wars, have peace, oh, it's the Russians now we're after, and that's the problem. That's the new war. And it's funny, I'm not a Marxist, and I speak pretty harsh about Marxism, but they do make good points about capitalism and imperialism, and use of war to enforce empire and to pillage the third world of resources to maintain power. And just because you disagree with the philosophy doesn't mean there aren't a few things in that philosophy that have some credibility. And that point about economic imperialism, and using the military as well for that purpose of imperialism and to plunder resources. The Marxists make a few good points. So I have to say, good one there, good one there. We have to pay attention to that. You learn from your enemies, you learn from other philosophies, even if you don't agree with them. And if you learn from those people that you wouldn't necessarily think to learn from, you make yourself smarter, and you can make better decisions in the future. But that's not what we do here in the United States. We plunder ahead boneheadedly, and continue our global imperialism to our own detriment at some point in the future, when it all comes collapsing down, and that's what I fear. Well, that's it for now. Again, if you are new to my channel, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.